you have your Bibles, please turn to the Old Testament book of Genesis, chapter 11. Genesis 11, verses 1 through 11. Now the whole earth had one language, the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." They had a brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. You've all probably heard and read the story about the Tower of Babel. And most of the time when we hear that story, we just look at it as some people built a high-rise building. God looked at it and said, "I don't like this," and then invented the languages of Spanish and German and French and Chinese and English. The story of Babel, though, is more than just a story of a high-rise tower. Now, that high-rise tower maybe was 300 feet in height, so it's been assumed by Bible scholars. But when high-rise buildings are constructed, most of them are all for the use of people. The tallest building in the world now is called the Phoenix Towers in China, and they are 3,200 feet. Now, that's pretty tall, over a half mile in height. 100 floors of mall retail stores, for those of you who like to shop. Has apartments, has penthouses for people to live in, office spaces for companies. Did the Tower of Babel have practical use for human beings? I think to understand what's happening here, we have to see it from the context of their world, because I don't think there is any way we can understand it from our world. It's hard to understand an event that happens over 6,000 years ago. And when you look at this event, you kind of wonder, what's the big deal? High-rise buildings are nothing new to us in our lifetime. All of us have probably, obviously, seen them and been inside of them. How many's ever been in the Empire State Building in New York City? I went there one time and got to the top of it and looked down, and I just wanted to grab onto those bars. Something about being in heights makes me nervous. Also, you may be thinking, what does the story of the Tower of Babel have to do with Christmas time? Well, let me just tell you that this story begins a chain of events leading to the birth of Christ, and you'll see and understand that more in a little bit. Babel is the first record of a significant number of people attempting to establish a city or a nation state. You might ask, why did they build this tower? Well, was it for luxury condos so that people could have a nice view of the city? Maybe it was a luxury hotel. Or a government building, was that why they built this? Or a retail office space? Or was it to impress the ancient world with their know-how and technology to build such a structure? If you look at the commentators, they'll say that the bricks that these people used over 6,000 years ago to build this structure were high tech for their time. They were especially baked bricks. They were new technology. Some see this event as an arrogant statement that human beings had become great and greater than God, as great as God in their own eyes. Some have thought that the Tower of Babel was a monument to humanity, saying to God, look what we can do. We can reach the heavens. We don't need you any longer. We can achieve great things on our own. But in reality, this event is quite the opposite of that. This was not a statement of human arrogance or of human ability. The Tower of Babel is what's called a ziggurat. Now, how many's ever heard of that? Not cigarette, ziggurat. These types of structures served the ancient world as a spiritual thing, for spiritual purposes. They were built like a stairway. If you had what looked like a pyramid structure, you would see that they were built with stairs on all four sides. I've actually seen one of these before in Egypt, and they say it was even older than the pyramids. But they literally have steps going up to the top of the building, built all around the structure. Ziggurats were not built to be a stairway to heaven. We have to apologize to Led Zeppelin, right? Instead, they were built to be a stairway or gateway or entrance for God to come down to them, not for them to walk up and say, God, look what we can do. But instead, they were literally a gateway. They were a stairway for the gods to come down and be among the people. A stairway from heaven. This was not a building that was made for people, obviously. It was made for God. It was a private gateway for God to travel down to his sacred space. At the bottom of these ziggurats were temples, a sacred place for God. That God would travel down, and they would have their own place for them to dwell in, for their presence to rest. So this tower was built for God, for him to come down to them and inhabit his sacred space. And in order for that to happen, they built a stairway, God would go down, and these sacred spaces were made for God to be worshiped and exalted, to be among his people. So the citizens of Babel wanted God to be with them. Now that's kind of a different look at the story. They built this so that God could come down to them and be in their presence. Now that sounds pretty legitimate, right? And we might ask ourselves, well, then what's the problem? How come God didn't like that? These people look like they're building a door or an entrance for God to come down and be in their presence. Well, the problem with the Tower of Babel was that the people had ulterior motivation for building this structure. The sacred place is a place for God to be exalted and worshiped. It's just like the sanctuary here at this church facility. This room here is made for God to be worshiped and exalted. It is not a showcase for the preacher or for the band or for the choir or anybody else. It's not a performance hall. This is a place for God to be exalted and worshiped. And that's what the sacred place was created for. But the people of Babel had a different motivation for bringing God into their presence to be exalted and worshiped. Verse 4 tells us what their real motivation was behind this. In verse 4 they say, let us make a name for ourselves. Now this was an elaborate scheme to bribe God into giving them what they wanted. A name for themselves was what they truly desired, not worship and exalting God, but they wanted to be, actually they were hoping to become a great nation state and not have to be scattered throughout the world. They were hoping that God's blessing would be upon their plans. Their plan was to become great, to become a nation state. And they were hoping that by doing this, God would bless their plans. by giving him a stairway for him to come into their presence, God would owe them. Now, this is not an uncommon wish with people. How many have ever thought, well, God, if I do this, then maybe you'll bless me? You don't have to raise your hand and say, kind of make a deal with God. If I go to church faithfully, if I read my Bible every day, maybe you'll give me the desire of my heart. 6-7 years ago, I had a lady stop by my church office. And I didn't know her, I had never met her before. She just happened to, I dropped by the church and stopped in. She wanted to talk to the pastor, so they brought her to my office. And she was lamenting the fact that she had lost her job recently, and that the week before she had wrecked her car on the Howard Franklin Bridge in Tampa on her way to a job interview, which she obviously missed. And she was telling me that she's been desperately looking for a job. She can't pay her bills. And she didn't ask for any help. She was just wanted to tell me her story. And she was frustrated because she couldn't understand why this was happening to her. She felt she deserved better. She said that since she had lost her job and began her search for a job, that she had faithfully attended church every single Sunday. She said in her spare time, instead of watching TV, she listened to Christian music. And she said, Pastor, I've even stopped having sex with my boyfriend in hopes that God would bless me. And she couldn't understand why God was not blessing her efforts. And she said to me, he owes me something better. I kind of think that's what's going on here with the Tower of Babel. God, look what we've done. Look what we've built. Trying to bribe God into ensuring that they would have the future that they envisioned, that they hoped for. You see, ever since Genesis chapter 3, human beings had not had a sacred place for the presence of God to dwell in their midst. He had been there in the Garden of Eden. It was a sacred place. In the Garden of Eden, there was perfection. There was abundance. There was order. There was human dominion over all creation. It was a utopian existence for human beings. But we all know what happened. They got kicked out. They at one time had access to God in the Garden of Eden, and they were in his presence. They could talk to God in the evening. As they walked through the garden, they could have a conversation with God. God would speak back to them. I think they were trying to reestablish what they lost in Genesis chapter 3, and that is God in their presence. It was a good, innovative plan. Build God a private entrance to his place in the heart of their city. It's a good plan. Give him the red carpet treatment. Give him a first-class welcome. Go all out so that God would come into our city and into our midst. Even the bricks and the technology that they used to build the tower were very costly. They were high-tech bricks for their age, but they cost a lot of money to make. You say, well, how come it cost so much money? Well, because it required a lot of fuel to fire these bricks, so it was very costly. But they did it not so they could worship and exalt God, but they did it so they could make a name for themselves and become a successful nation. But it says it didn't work, right? It bombed, it failed. God rejected their initiative because it was not his will. They weren't doing it for him, they were doing it for themselves. So then we move on from this event to the next chapter in Genesis chapter 12. And we see God here begin his own initiative to establish access to him and to establish a sacred place for his presence to dwell among his people. The first